come on to the front. We'll have an intimate talk here.
I think mine's, there we go.
Yeah,
Hi, everyone.
this is the GOBSEC chat where it gets informal. And so we're going to be very informal and just try to open it up to the room too. We're going to use Slido. So we want to have a conversation and we're going to talk about ideas. And we have a real incredible idea generator here. Glenn is like the James Bond of ideas. You can't find any information about this guy. His company didn't even have a website till recently, but he's helped generate ideas for brands for the last 10, 15 years that have changed the world. And so we're going to talk about ideas. But Glenn, maybe tell, since we can't find you online, who you are and what you do and why you're doing it.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction. So I've run a bunch of different companies and projects, as Randall mentioned, that have all stemmed from my passion, which was around what the education system looks like and what the future of learning and how people can grow as individuals. And I've always made it my mantra to kind of highlight the successes of the people I work with, rather than maybe take the credit for that work or try and be bolstered myself in some way. So the first kind of thing that I started with was that the education system when I was growing up just really didn't work for me. I was 15 years old, really frustrated. I was getting careers advice that basically said, you're either going to go and be a lawyer or you're going to go and stack shelves in a supermarket. And so I wanted to turn that into something that I was passionate about, and I wanted to be a journalist, actually. So I turned that into...
You're stuck with the stacking shelves.
I think it became this thing where, I had a teacher that told me, your English isn't good enough to become a journalist, so don't do it. And I said, well, no, actually, you know what? I'm going to launch a magazine. And when I was 15 years old, I ended up putting together a prospect and launching a magazine that went out there into the market. And it grew quite successful. And it ended up featuring very big stars, celebrities, music, fashion, and all sorts of other stuff. And it became quite a big product.
Why we're wearing hats, by the way.
I know, absolutely. So this is the discussion of the two hats.
Yes.
I'm going to have a hat off, so I'm going to keep mine too.
I'm going to ask you a Slido of a survey who wears it better later. So.
Yeah, okay, we'll work with that one. But it was the main thing for me was that people weren't being inspired to think differently about the ways in which they could learn and be challenged in doing that. And so what I started doing was profiling other careers to young people that they could start considering. And that led me into doing lots of other campaigns. So I grew an organization out of that, a marketing agency. We were headhunted by Google at the time, and we became responsible for delivering enterprise campaigns all around the world. And those campaigns were simply successful because we focused on what were the vulnerabilities people had in the missing skills gaps that they weren't getting from traditional systems.
So tell us some of the people you've since advised. You have quite a roster, at least ones you could talk about.
So I guess, well, the first starting point was, when Google called you up and it was one of the VPs, I actually thought it was a friend just joking around, and I nearly put the phone down. I'm glad I didn't do it in that instance. But, Google came to us and said, will you help us work with companies that want to grow online? But this was around a fundamental thing that actually around the world, there's a big lack of digital skills. And Google actually wanted to be a solution in that piece. And I said, well, we need to distill this down to what are the biggest challenges that people perceive. And that was, number one, that they don't know how to do it. They don't have the skills. Number two, it'll cost too much of their time or too much money. And quite simply, number three, that they don't want to devote the time because they won't have the time to do it. So we said, well, what does it look like if you turn that into a product and productize that type of learning? And we created an initiative that has now been rolled out all around the world. But even in the UK alone, across an 18-month period, I think it got across a 12-month period, it got 1.8 million new SMEs online that had never been online before. And that project has now become the global digital skills program that Google runs and has been running for the last kind of decade. But I mean, we work with Virgin Group, the World Bank, many other organizations on different programs that look at ways in which fundamentally brands can be useful in people's lives. because I think that's what converts to loyalty and better conversion overall, is that if a brand can find a way of being useful, which for me is about being informative, which goes back to how brands actually support education systems,
And
then
tell us the difference between a brand being useful and a product being useful. I understand how my iPhone is useful. I'm not sure how Apple is useful.
that's a good question. So I think that fundamentally should come down to what are the values of the company behind the product. And that is that if a company really wants loyalty and really wants conversion, then truly to engage, they need to look at the impact they're having in the life of that consumer beyond the product. And that is that I think people are realizing in sustainability and sustainable economies that it comes down to what you can do to be useful in the day-to-day life. So whether or not that's being more socially conscious, socially aware, or ethical for the environment and your footprint, or whether that's educating consumers in a new way. You know, if you're a financial services company, actually the really exciting thing could be how you support people's financial literacy, or how, you know, in different fintech innovations right now, you can start looking at what a brand is doing in helping you to save money. Fundamentally by looking at your spending habits and what you're doing day to day. So I think it's all about where you serve a purpose at different points in time in someone's life.
Let's talk, since we're talking, this panel's about ideas and driving change through ideas. Forbes turned 100 about 18 months ago. It was our 100th birthday. We look pretty good for 100. And so we surveyed, we did a feature, it was 100 greatest living business minds, and we got almost all of them. We just, Gates and Buffett and Branson and all around the world, you know, Li Ka-shing um, and the we asked all of them, what's an idea for the future that that we can take and look for, and we got a lot of similar answers. So I want to kind of put some of these to you and figure out how this translates into what you hear and how we can use these new technologies that are going to change and turn them into positive change, because that's what we heard a lot this morning about the need for that. So, you know, number one is AI. Everyone was talking about AI. I don't think there's any surprise there. But so first, so AI, how's this going to affect everything that you're working on, everything that everybody in this room is working on, where we're talking about the cross-section of corporations, entrepreneurs, government, NGOs, et cetera?
So I think that's fundamental to the future of education, and in fact the future of service provision overall for me, is that AI, what goes behind the idea of artificial intelligence and what we're looking at is, you know, essentially there needs to be some sort of code of ethics, I believe, in fact, in terms of what people are applying and what that looks like. Because when you interpret artificial intelligence as a product or service in someone's life, particularly in the education system, you start actually, you know, automatically by definition, dictating what something else is deciding for you. And so there comes a point when globally governments, big corporations need to start looking at where does the level of responsibility lie in terms of how their AI has an impact on what people do next. Because you've got some pretty amazing instances now, which if we talk about the youth of today coming forward into new learning models, you've got the idea of looking at deep fake. So deep fake technology, if anybody's heard about it or isn't familiar with it, is this idea, the best example most recently is of the Mona Lisa. And the Mona Lisa, I think it's Samsung has just created some technology that they've applied with their deepfake brand, which brings the Mona Lisa to life. And this is by just taking one singular bit of mapping of the Mona Lisa, and essentially it creates an animated version of it, which could look like there were many different types of the Mona Lisa painted that have never been painted before. If you're then a young person that's growing up in an education system showing you many different types of the Mona Lisa doing something, when you weren't really familiar with the fact there was only ever one Mona Lisa, then actually you've got a completely different interpretation of society and what that character or caricature of a Mona Lisa actually is. And while it engages people in the format, because actually, you know, you can take people to the Louvre in Paris and go and see it, you know, you're going to engage a young person much more by bringing that to life and animating it in the way that they're currently talking about than you might actually just in the basis of taking people there.
See, what I love about you, Glenn, is you're so optimistic, because deepfake technology also has a tremendous potential to disrupt democracy by just creating fake videos, and, you know, we're going to show, you know, President Kiska, just swimming in the Danube right now, and then you could just create total fiction. So you immediately go to how we could teach children, which is great. But then how do you harness that so it's not used for ill? I mean, there's no there's no one answer, of course, but how do we keep, what is it as you look to what you were talking about in the beginning of this, that, we need to work together to put ethical guidelines on AI. You go to the positive, but how do we prevent the negative? What can this room, which has a lot of governmental leaders in it and corporate leaders, do?
That is the real challenge. And I guess that's why I started with the idea that, we need to look at fundamentally the responsibility behind how AI is applied. And that is the secret here, that potentially that's an international code of ethics behind how AI is applied, and who is responsible for the actions that occur out of that. Because as you've said, that can very much lead to, a video of a president, a global leader, actually saying something that they never in fact said at all. I mean, we've already got instances where people are saying they've never said certain things that they've said anyway, but actually you've got this new world where, AI is going to say things for you, which is particularly terrifying in some instances. So, this is all comes down to how that's applied.
Panel moderating, by the way. AI's got it from here. So.
I know we're out of jobs. We don't need to do this. I think the really exciting thing is actually when we look at the impact AI can have on markets that haven't been able to afford access to traditional models of education. And that is in remote parts of Africa or different parts of India, for instance. There's two examples of two places that I've been recently looking at education formats. This is basically that these places went through a technological jump. And that is one of the big stats that sticks in my head from India in particular was the power of e-commerce in teaching people new skills. And I think I'm going to get the actual figures wrong, but they're pretty huge here. So it went from something like 20% of transactions in India happening in an online environment to almost 80% within a period of a few years. And that was down to the availability of smartphones and fundamentally actually the availability of cheap data. Not cheap, affordable data. And we've now got a tremendous shift that we're going to see in the ways in which that's going to completely revolutionize access to education in markets that never had it.
Well, one of the other things that came up was 5G. You just kind of walked right into it. So how is that, how quickly is that going to take, and how, from where you're sitting, is that going to change things, and how?
So 5G, there's been a buzz thing that lots of governments have been talking about for the last 5-10 years even. The main thing to do here is never ever think about comparing 5G to 4G or 3G, because you really can compare the two. 5G essentially, when rolled out, will give us, it's promised, up to 100 times the speed of 4G. What that actually means in terms of impact in our lives is that we're going to see unprecedented processing power. So I think a really good example to give here would be something like the agricultural industry. So the agricultural industry, something like 24 million connected devices exist right now in the world. In between now and 2024, that's predicted to be a few hundred million, something like 225 million connected devices because of 5G. What that does is changes the way that people manage their time, manage what they learn, but also the automation of that. So what 5G brings with it in its promise behind all the hype is an idea that we're going to have easier, better facilitated lives and better access to different resources. But alongside that, of course, comes a really big impact upon skills. And the largest impact that that's going to create is that within the next 2 decades, it's estimated by some different sources, I think The Economist was one that recently quoted this, that actually nearly 50% of all jobs, it's 47% I think in The Economist's quotation, 47% of all jobs will have the ability to be completely automated within the next couple of decades. Which is a terrifying prospect. But actually, this isn't about scaremongering that technology is going to mean that everyone's jobs are gone and taken over by robots. This is a really huge opportunity to create a whole different service set. And in Europe, actually, the European Union has got some fantastic initiatives around 5G. One of them is around a brilliant initiative using lampposts. So this is your everyday street lights that actually are gonna become the 5G beacons around the rest of Europe, but where you'll put the different receivers to allow people to engage and interact with different types of public services. And, you know, not just to know in a few seconds or in a refresh of an app if your bus is turning up, but actually how that service is impacting. Is it too full? What's happening with it? And all of the different other data sets that you maybe didn't have access to at your fingertips before. But it's the delivery of that service of 5G across global markets that didn't have that infrastructure of broadband, that are jumping literally generations and are going to have this technology thrust at them where they haven't had the development that other markets have. And that's a real transformation in educational learning models, particularly when you deal with, for instance, a rural school that has just done things using textbooks and now suddenly will eventually have access to this 5G technology that's going to completely transform the way they learn.
Again, that's the half full example, which is great. We have a question on Slido. And again, please keep asking questions. We're going to have a conversation with everybody here. It's a nice small room where we could do that about, you know, I mean, 5G obviously gives unlimited bandwidth, and we talked about AI really changing things. The question is whether government, you know, we talked about codes of ethics, but whether government could start to harness this unlimited computing power and processing power and AI against its own citizens. What do you think about that?
That's a big question.
Heavy.
Yeah, that's a big question. So we're already seeing, I will call it some of the scaremongering stories around China, which is that actually there's the development already happening of credit-based systems around how good a citizen you are or aren't. I find that actually a terrifying prospect, that I might be mapped by the way in which I engage with other parts of society, and that will therefore
You already are. It's called cookies.
Well, indeed, actually, well, that's a whole other topic, but we'll come back to that one. But I think the really fascinating thing here is that, you know, we're going into this world where, yes, governments are watching our every move. We are being analyzed. We are being looked at. There is more data available about us than ever before. I think where this comes into its own is really when you deal with the younger generation who know no different from that and from that environment. And that's where, you know, you see, I guess, that Instagram generation that have only grown up knowing those models.
So they're comfortable. You know, they like being targeted. They're like, oh, these ads are just for me. Good. They would probably revolt if they started getting ads in their feed for, you know, old person pills or something. They're like, no, I want what I want. I mean, how much? I mean, you know, it's something we obviously focus on at Forbes. You know, when we have our concurrent under 30 summit going on here in Bratislava this week. Whether or not this generation is in a position to, you know, solve a lot of these problems, but also they are being created by them. I mean, they're surrounded, and so it's kind of which way, you know, which way do you go? Because when you have a generation that is completely used to being, you know, having their data shared all the time, are they at peace with it because they're used to it, or are they the ones who solve it because they fundamentally understand the power of it?
So this is when you have to try and look at the
And you're a young gentleman, only 35. Glenn is a young, you know, so you can also speak for the youth.
ish.
Ish.
I think that becomes a thing where you have to take the view of education overall, and what does that look like for young people in terms of what they accept. So this is about whether or not we argue that young people overall are becoming disengaged from mainstream models. Mine is that, you know, I didn't go to university. I went straight from 15 into setting up my business model, and that was because I didn't like the way the education system was going to take 4 years for me to learn how to be a journalist. You know, and you know, I'll say that's continuous learning and evolution. I don't know if you'll agree. But I mean,
The trade.
it's something that you know, we look at attention spans, and actually what there is now an opportunity for is to reinvent models of education. So there's this thing around whether or not education should be completely transformed. I don't think it's a whole transformation. It's an evolution alongside different types of technology, and about whether or not somebody accepts being tracked or where their online identity is and what that looks like. Actually, this is I'm going to go with the half full approach. This is an opportunity for personalization of learning. And we've heard a lot in the past about personalization of tech, but this is a real opportunity for personalization of learning. I'll give you just a couple of examples. So I've just become a brand ambassador for an education tech company. And they've been doing some amazing projects.
How do I get one of those jobs? Brand ambassador.
one of those.
One of those jobs you don't have to go to the office every day. It's like
I work hard. I work hard. One of those projects that we've been doing is called Beats Not Blades, and this was about different parts of, as you might imagine, disenfranchised, disengaged youth in different parts of society that had had no interest in education systems before, but had been using music to learn different parts of the curriculum. And that project has absolutely transformed the lives of those individuals. But there's a whole argument there then that what could the role of the music industry be more widely in being able, again, to be useful in people's lives. They're trying to find a new types of relevance and new ways forward. But this model of actually using music and other types of learning methodology to apply to individuals' needs has been transformative in different parts of society. And we're working with tens of thousands of young people in different types of projects that implement these sorts of things. In the one client of mine you mentioned, which is Virgin Group, we did a project. Virgin wanted to look to work with more young people and encourage young talent to grow. And I said, well, again, the way in which to do that is to be useful in young people's lives, because Virgin as a brand was looking for the next thing it was doing. So I said, well, why don't we create our own qualification? Like a brand making its own qualification that's the equivalent level of half an A level in the UK. So I said, why don't we do this where we challenge young people to make their own business? But this is all about making people look at learning in ways where you don't relate it to traditional learning. So we created a structure where we did a call out and we said, what would it look like if a young...
Benson himself is an unconventional learner. I mean, he's a...
Absolutely. Well, that was the perfect figurehead for us to work with. But this was like, we said, well, what would it look like if young people made their own festival? And they made that happen. So we built this whole course that was built around actually what was an online business plan, without the people as participants realizing that they were being told to make a marketing strategy, a financial plan, and all these other bits. Because if they were pushed with that as one overall piece, maybe they wouldn't have engaged with the project. But we challenged this and said, we are then going to reward you with going and being mentored at different music festivals, learning how to work the trade. And these young people that are engaged in this, I mean, we thought we were going to have a few thousand entries across a 6-month period. We had over 10,000 in the first 24 hours. So it blew us away that actually young people, when you really inspire them to learn, are more than willing. And that said to me that traditional education needed to reassess the way it was being delivered.
Well, it also talks to, you know, and I know we only have a few more minutes, but it speaks to the future of work. I mean, we have a question that came in from Mikhail about whether or not humans, which jobs will not be able to be replaced by AI. It speaks to what you were just talking about, which is, creativity and the idea that AI will never, it'll be able to create things. It, won't be able to spark things that the human brain can't. And so, maybe there's some hope in that. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on creativity and the future of, it's our best asset, I hope.
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, that's, well, we're picking up on kind of that point. I think if everybody in this audience here, if I asked you, right, who in the audience considers themselves creative? If you raise your hand if you consider yourself creative. Oh, we've got a reasonable
Half and half.
Half and half. So my challenge would be, for anyone who didn't put their hands up, who told you you're not creative? And the really interesting thing there is, again, what the traditional education system has conditioned us to believe a creative person is, a non-creative person, a person good at math or not good at math is. And this is fundamentally, for me, what I think is wrong with the existing system. That, for me, creativity is the ability to problem solve. And every single one of us in this room, in our jobs, learns how to problem solve. And that is problem solving effectively. And, creativity, it makes the world go round. And that, for me, is just having a completely different approach as to how we view this. And as to, is AI taking our jobs? What are the ones that are going to exist in the future? That's, again, down to how that person decides to interpret what their view of usefulness to a client is. I had somebody that I was working with, a banking client, and I went in and I was talking to the asset finance team, and I said, what do you perceive to be the biggest challenge in your role? And eventually I teased out of him that he realized that it was going to take him 2 weeks to come back with the answer on funding somebody, that an application was going to tell them within the hour. And I said, well, you've already answered your own questions to where your job might be in a few years' time if you don't look at other ways that you can be useful to that client. But he already didn't realize that he's got the ability to be useful to that client. He just not unlocked the ways in which he could do it. And that's, he could do partnership creation, for many, many other things. But that's about just viewing the ways in which we upskill. Because we're not, that skills gap piece is that we're not just going to be faced with the previous generations. The statistic about nearly 50% of people being jobs being automated in the future is matched by one that currently 53%, roughly 53% of all existing people within the global workforce need to be reskilled or upskilled. That is a phenomenal statistic, and that is, again, within the next couple of decades. So what we're really looking at here is how do we deal with the middle skills gap that we're going to be creating by the advancements of technology.
A little bit of pessimism, that's refreshing, but mostly optimism from Glenn Pegler. Thank you. I think we're out of time, but I know you're hanging around, so if you want to get optimistic, grab the other guy with the hat here, and I'm sure he'll give you a good dose. But we appreciate the time and this nice, intimate environment. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.